What if the reason you feel different today is not because you changed, but because your mind quietly learned that feeling too much was no longer safe? Because when an empath is hurt repeatedly, something inside them doesn't break suddenly, it reorganizes slowly. And by the time you notice it, you are no longer experiencing life the same way at all. If you have ever felt like you became more distant, more quiet, or less emotionally open over time, this is not random. There is a psychological process happening underneath it, one that most people never recognize while it is unfolding. And understanding it can completely change how you see your own emotional world. Stay with this, because what happens internally is far more complex than sadness, and far more important than most people realize. There is a certain kind of person who feels everything before they even understand it. They don't just notice emotions in others, they absorb them, like the feelings are happening inside their own mind and body. Over time, this becomes confusing because the world around them does not respond the same way. People move on quickly, forget easily, and rarely carry the emotional weight they leave behind. But the empath does, and slowly, without realizing it, the world starts using this sensitivity against them. Not always directly, not always with intent, but consistently enough that something inside them begins to shut down just to survive what they feel every day. And here is what nobody really explains to them in a clear way. The silence that follows repeated emotional pain is not peace, and it is not healing in the beginning. It feels like quiet, but underneath that quiet is something much heavier. It is the sound of internal withdrawal. It is what happens when a mind that once responded deeply starts protecting itself by reducing response altogether. This is not sudden. It is gradual, and the person experiencing it often does not recognize it as loss at first. They only notice they are becoming less reactive, less open, and strangely distant from things they once felt deeply connected to. If you have ever loved too hard, forgiven too quickly, or understood people who never tried to understand you back, then this is not just a message. It is a reflection of a pattern you may already be living inside. Because what happens next is not simple sadness. It is a deeper psychological shift in how a person processes emotion, trust, and connection. And if you do not understand it, you will mistake your own transformation for strength, when in reality, it may be emotional exhaustion turning into numbness. So stay with this, because what follows is not just explanation, it is awareness of a process most people never see in themselves. To understand this properly, we have to be clear about what kind of person we are talking about.
The word empath is often used casually, but in its deeper psychological sense, it describes someone whose emotional sensitivity is significantly heightened compared to average perception. This is not about personality preference or being sentimental. It is about how the nervous system processes emotional signals from other people. For such individuals, emotional information is not external, it is internalized. They do not simply recognize sadness, anger, or fear in others. They simulate it internally in a way that makes it feel personally experienced rather than observed. At the neurological level, this is linked to how certain brain systems respond to social and emotional cues. The mind is built to understand others through internal simulation, but in highly sensitive individuals, this system becomes unusually active. So when someone else is in distress, the empath does not remain at a distance. They resonate with it. It reflects inside them like an echo that does not fade quickly.
This is why emotional environments affect them so deeply. A room is never just a room, it is an emotional field, and they enter it already responding to things that have not even been spoken out loud yet. Imagine moving through life with a kind of emotional awareness that constantly picks up what others are not saying. You enter a space and immediately feel tension without any words being exchanged. You speak to someone who smiles politely, but something in your perception detects that the smile is covering something heavier underneath. You sit with people who appear normal on the surface, but you feel their internal unrest as if it is pressing against your own awareness. Over time, this creates a reality where emotional truth is always louder than verbal truth, and silence often says more than speech ever could. Now, the difficult question appears naturally from this experience.
What happens to someone who perceives this much in a world that often avoids emotional depth? The answer is not simple, but it is consistent. They become emotionally used, not always intentionally, not always in obvious ways, but in patterns that repeat across relationships, friendships, and even family systems. Because when someone can feel deeply, others often rely on that depth without realizing the cost it creates for the person carrying it. There are individuals who consciously or unconsciously are drawn to emotional sensitivity because it provides something they lack. They may not understand it in clear terms, but they sense that an empath will listen longer, forgive faster, and stay longer than most people would. In psychological terms, this becomes a dynamic where emotional resources are taken repeatedly without equal return. Attention, patience, forgiveness, and understanding flow in one direction. And because the empath is naturally inclined to give, the imbalance does not immediately appear as harm, but as connection.
In relationships, this can become especially complex. The empath often tries to understand rather than judge, to stay rather than leave, to explain rather than reject. They carry emotional discomfort that does not belong to them, believing it is their responsibility to ease it. Over time, they may start apologizing for things they did not cause, or staying in situations that consistently drain them because they can sense the other person's need. This is not a lack of awareness, it is an overextension of empathy that overrides personal boundaries. It is important to correct a misunderstanding here. This pattern is not weakness. It is not a flaw in character. It is a structural vulnerability that comes from one of the most advanced forms of human emotional intelligence: compassion. The ability to feel others deeply is not something that should be dismissed or reduced.
But without boundaries, even the most noble capacities can become harmful to the person who holds them. The issue is not empathy itself, but the lack of protection around it in environments that do not respect emotional limits. The tragedy is that harm does not usually arrive as a single moment, it arrives gradually through repeated emotional inconsideration, small manipulations, unspoken expectations, and subtle emotional dependence. Each moment alone feels manageable. Each situation seems explainable, but together they form a pattern that slowly reshapes how the empath sees themselves. They begin to doubt their perceptions, question their boundaries, and normalize emotional imbalance as part of connection. This is where deeper internal changes begin long before the person recognizes what is happening. And when this pattern continues long enough, the mind starts building something new internally. It begins to map emotional environments in advance, predicting where pain might come from before it happens. This is not conscious thinking, it is a survival adaptation.
The nervous system starts organizing experience into warning signals, scanning for emotional risk, and preparing for disappointment before engagement even begins. Psychologists often refer to this emerging structure as a threat mapping process, where emotional memory begins shaping future perception in order to prevent repeated harm. Your nervous system, that ancient and highly refined biological system, shaped over millions of years for one purpose, survival, begins to stop treating people like people. Instead, it starts treating the social world like a battlefield. Not metaphorically in your experience, but literally in the way your body reacts. Every interaction starts to feel loaded with risk. Every pause in a conversation begins to feel like something is about to go wrong. Every delay in response, every change in tone, every shift in expression becomes a signal that must be decoded before it turns into pain.
This is what hypervigilance feels like, and it is exhausting in a way that is very difficult to explain to someone who has never lived inside it. Imagine your mind running a constant background process during every interaction you have, a silent analysis that never turns off. You are speaking, listening, smiling, functioning normally on the outside, but inside another system is always active. It is scanning for rejection, abandonment, disappointment, or emotional danger. Even when nothing is wrong, your body behaves as if something might go wrong at any second. Now imagine this not happening occasionally, but constantly. Every conversation becomes layered. You are no longer just hearing words, you are interpreting intent behind them. A short reply is not just a short reply, it becomes a possible sign of disinterest. A neutral expression is not neutral anymore. It becomes something to investigate. You start reading meaning into things that other people do automatically without thought.
And slowly, without realizing it, your mind becomes trained to expect emotional harm before emotional safety. This is why even peaceful environments can feel unsafe. You might be sitting with people who care about you, laughing around you, existing in a moment that should feel light, but your nervous system refuses to fully participate. It is still scanning, still watching, still preparing. Because at some point in your past experience, closeness and pain became connected. And once that connection is formed, the body does not forget easily. It learns to protect you by staying alert, even when there is nothing obvious to protect against. The cruel contradiction here is that the same system that allows deep emotional connection also becomes the reason you struggle to experience it. The empath is naturally designed for depth, for emotional presence, for real connection. But hypervigilance interrupts that process.
Because true connection requires relaxation into the moment, and hypervigilance replaces relaxation with constant monitoring. It turns presence into analysis. It turns experience into prediction. And over time, this makes closeness feel dangerous even when it is safe. At this stage, vulnerability begins to feel like a risk instead of a bridge. Opening up feels less like trust and more like exposure. And so the nervous system begins to make a decision without asking you directly. It starts to close emotional gates automatically, not because you want distance, but because your system has learned that openness has historically led to pain. This is where biology takes over psychology. Your values may still believe in love, trust, and connection, but your body begins to operate on a different rule entirely. Avoid what has hurt you before. This is not a flaw in character. It is not emotional failure.
It is the nervous system doing exactly what it was designed to do when faced with repeated emotional threat. Its job is not to keep you open, it is to keep you alive. But the problem is that emotional environments are not physical dangers, even though the body often responds as if they are. And so a system built for survival in physical reality begins to misinterpret relational reality. And that misinterpretation slowly reshapes how you experience people. As this continues, something even deeper begins to form. You stop experiencing interactions as they are and start experiencing them as your nervous system predicts they might become. You are no longer fully in the present moment. A part of you is always slightly ahead, preparing for disappointment, preparing for emotional impact, preparing for withdrawal. This creates a subtle but constant distance between you and life itself. You are there, but not fully there.
Engaged, but not fully safe enough to relax into engagement. And over time, this constant internal scanning becomes normal. You stop noticing it because it becomes your baseline. You think this is just how you are now, more careful, more aware, more observant. But underneath those labels is something more complex. It is a system that has learned to prioritize prediction over presence. And when that happens long enough, the mind begins to reorganize itself around avoidance rather than connection. At this point, another shift begins quietly in the background, because when you are constantly scanning the outside world for emotional threat, you have less and less space left to feel your own internal world clearly. Your attention is pulled outward so often that your inner voice starts to fade into background noise. You begin to notice others more than you notice yourself. Their moods, their reactions, their needs become clearer than your own emotional state. And slowly, this creates a gap.
A gap between what you feel and what you recognize that you feel. You are still emotional, but less aware of your own emotional ownership. You feel things, but you are no longer always sure where they come from. Are you anxious because you are anxious, or because someone near you is anxious? Are you tired because you are tired, or because you absorbed exhaustion from someone else? These questions become harder to answer the more this pattern continues. This is where the boundaries of emotional identity begin to blur. And once they blur, something fundamental shifts in how you experience yourself. This withdrawal is often mistaken by the people around them as emotional coldness, detachment, or even cruelty. The person who once responded instantly, who was always emotionally available, who reached out before being asked, suddenly becomes quieter. They start canceling plans without long explanations. They stop initiating conversations.
Their replies shrink from long, thoughtful messages into short, minimal responses. And naturally, people around them react with confusion. They say things like, "You've changed," or "You're not the same anymore," or "Something is different about you." And they are not wrong in noticing the change. Something has changed deeply. But what they misunderstand is the nature of that transformation. It is not indifference. It is not a loss of care. It is self-preservation finally becoming stronger than emotional instinct after years of being ignored. What looks like emotional distance is actually the psyche closing doors that were previously left wide open. It is the nervous system and emotional mind finally agreeing that unlimited access to others without protection or boundaries has become unsafe. The empath learns, often painfully and without guidance, that openness without discernment is not a moral strength in itself. It is not pure virtue.
It is a vulnerability that allows harm to enter repeatedly without resistance. And once this realization sets in, it does not arrive gently. It arrives through experience, through exhaustion, through emotional depletion that accumulates over time until the system simply cannot continue operating in the same way. The tragedy is that this realization often comes without structure or guidance. Because most empaths have never been taught emotional boundaries, they do not develop gradual control. There is no middle space between full emotional openness and full emotional shutdown. So instead of learning to regulate access, they shift between extremes. Either they are fully available, absorbing everything, or they are completely closed off, emotionally unavailable and withdrawn. There is no stable in between.
And in the closed state, something important is always lost along with protection, connection, warmth, spontaneity, and the natural flow of emotional exchange that once defined their presence. This is where grief begins to form in a deeper way. Because the empath does not only lose people or situations, they lose access to their own way of being in the world. They become someone who can no longer connect with the same ease they once had. And even though withdrawal protects them, it also isolates them. The loneliness that follows is not ordinary loneliness. It is not simply the absence of people. It is the absence of emotional resonance. They may still be surrounded by others, still present in social spaces, still functioning in daily life, but internally, something essential feels unreachable. The deeper pain comes from the awareness that they built their identity around emotional openness. They were the ones who understood, who stayed, who forgave, who held emotional space for others.
And now that version of themselves feels distant. They begin to ask a question that does not have an easy answer. Who am I if I am no longer the one who feels everything? This question does not appear loudly. It arises in silence, in moments of reflection, in the spaces where emotional noise has faded. And it carries existential weight because it challenges the very foundation of how they have understood their value as a person. At this stage, identity begins to destabilize, not in a dramatic collapse, but in a slow and quiet disorientation. The empath realizes that much of what they considered their personality was actually a response to others. Their kindness, their patience, their emotional availability, all of it was shaped in relation to external needs. And now, with withdrawal, those reference points disappear. Without others to emotionally respond to, they struggle to define themselves internally. This is not confusion in the ordinary sense.
It is a fragmentation of self-narrative where the story they told about who they are no longer fully holds together, and so the mind begins searching for continuity. It tries to reconstruct identity from memory, from past behavior, from old emotional patterns. But something feels incomplete because the self they are trying to return to was never fully independent. It was formed through adaptation, through emotional labor, through constant attunement to others. And when those external demands are reduced, the structure built around them begins to feel unstable. This is where deeper psychological discomfort emerges, not because the person is lost, but because they are no longer fully defined by roles they once inhabited. Eventually, emotional blunting begins to appear. It does not arrive as a sudden shutdown. It arrives gradually, like a dimming of internal intensity. Things that once carried deep emotional weight begin to feel softer, quieter, less impactful.
Music does not move them the same way. Conversations feel more distant. Emotional experiences that once created strong internal responses now pass through with reduced intensity. This is not emotional absence. It is emotional regulation pushed too far by a system attempting to protect itself from overload. At this point, something more subtle begins to happen internally. The empath starts internalizing the emotional voices they were exposed to during repeated harm. Criticism, invalidation, dismissal, and emotional manipulation do not remain external experiences. Over time, they are absorbed into internal dialogue. The mind begins to repeat patterns of thought that sound like self-judgment, but are actually echoes of external influence. This is how the internal critic is formed, not as original self-hate, but as borrowed perception mistaken for self-truth. This internal voice does not feel foreign. It feels like clarity. It sounds like realism.
It presents itself as insight, but its origin is external, and because it is internalized, it becomes more damaging than the original source, since it is now self-directed. The empath begins to question their own emotional reactions, their sensitivity, their boundaries, and even their right to feel deeply. Over time, this creates a cycle where external harm becomes internal conflict. And yet, despite all of this, something important remains underneath the distortion. The original capacity for empathy does not disappear. It becomes buried, covered, and temporarily muted, but not destroyed. It still exists beneath the protective layers the mind has constructed. And this is where recovery becomes possible, not by returning to the old version of openness, but by rebuilding emotional intelligence with structure, awareness, and boundaries that did not exist before. Because the goal is not to return to unlimited emotional exposure. The goal is to integrate sensitivity with discernment, to feel deeply without being consumed.
To care without self-erasure, to remain open without becoming vulnerable to repeated harm. This requires learning a form of emotional precision that was never taught, only learned through pain. And this is where transformation begins, not in going back, but in building forward. In conclusion, what we are really looking at is not the loss of empathy, but the exhaustion of it when it has been given without protection for too long. The withdrawal, the silence, the emotional distance, and even the numbness are not signs of emptiness. They are signs of a system trying to restore balance after being overwhelmed for a long time. What once felt like natural openness becomes guarded, not because the capacity to care is gone, but because it has been forced to survive in environments that did not respect its limits. But nothing about this process is final. The mind does not only break, it also adapts.
And what has been shut down for protection can, with awareness, be understood and gradually rebuilt. Not by returning to the same patterns that caused harm, but by learning a new way of being with emotions where sensitivity is guided by awareness and care is supported by boundaries. This is where real strength begins, not in feeling less, but in learning how to feel without losing yourself in the process. And so the deeper truth is this: the ability to feel deeply is not the problem. The absence of protection around it is what creates suffering. Once that is understood, everything changes, because then the goal is no longer to stop feeling, but to finally learn how to feel in a way that allows you to remain whole, steady, and present in your own life.